Good evening, everybody. All of us know medical science is a rapidly advancing field where yesterday's fact may become matter for the archives to store, and today's fact may not find agreement with experts of tomorrow. Continuing medical education is therefore an integral part of medical profession. We have a galaxy of speakers of national and international repute who have excelled in their fields, and I'm sure you will enjoy the deliberations, and this would immensely contribute to better patient care. The first talk is on preventive cardiology, and the speaker is no other person but Dr. Jagat Narula. He is a doyen and pillar of cardiovascular imaging. He is Philip J. and Harriet Goldhart Chair in Cardiovascular Medicine. He is Chief of the Division of Cardiology at Mount Sinai Hospital, Morningside, Associate Dean of Global Health at the Ishan School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, Founder Editor of Chief Jack Cardiovascular Imaging 2007 to 2017, that is 10 years, Editor-in-Chief of Global Heart, a publication of WHF for 7 years, and he is the unique distinction of being able to combine molecular and subcellular pathology with clinical imaging of the failing myocardium and high-risk coronary atheromatoous plaques to develop novel strategies for prevention of cardiovascular disease and promotion of cardiovascular health in developed as well as the developing countries. He has 1,500 original research publications and has received several awards like the Gifted Educator Award, the Distinguished Scientist Award, the Distinguished Fellow Award, and International Service Award. He has a masterly approach of slowly unmasking the depth of the problem, and he always leaves behind an everlasting imprint on the mind of the audience. So with this, we start with first session, and the chairpersons for this session is Dr. Ashok Tailani and Janal. Dr. Tailani, please start the session. Dr. Tailani, please. Dr. Tailani, you are mute.
Dr. Tailani, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me all?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, hi. Welcome, Dr. Narula, and welcome everyone. So yeah, I think that was a very great introduction by Dr. Manoria. I still remember I first ever met Dr. Narula when I was a baby registrar in US in San Francisco during one of my ACC meet, post-ACC meet, and he left everlasting impression on my naive brain how to be a successful cardiologist. So I'll hear from Dr. Narula first, and then we have a quick debate about this upcoming everlasting question.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tailani, and Dr. Manoria, Dr. Nanda Saab, Amrishi, and Pankaj. And first important thing that whenever you receive a topic from Dr. Manoria, you have to really think about it. He's a philosopher. And you basically have to really look at it. What exactly did he want me to speak today? And specifically when he sent the topic like the nuances of predicting the risk of acute myocardial infarction in future. So, and what a clinician should do. And I was literally going through the definitions of nuances. I got through all kinds of Wikipedias and dictionaries and all as to what exactly Dr. Manoria wanted. So Prabhasji, this will be my best attempt that I can. So taking into account, where is my cursor? Okay. So taking into account of or including small but important differences. So what exactly can we do when we are looking at the plaques which are likely to have an adverse outcome or an unfavorable outcome? So can you see my slides? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So the biggest contribution of the Framingham Heart Study to us is the development of risk factors. So these are causally related to disease. They have a dose-response relationship. And if you prevent the risk factors, the disease is reversed. So essentially showing a clear-cut relationship and a causal relationship between certain factors and coronary artery disease. And we have followed them for the last 60 to 70 years that the Framingham proposed them first. And as you can see here in this particular slide, that these are the deciles of the hypercholesterolemia, as you can see in the left-hand panel, and the increasing ratio, odds ratio of having an acute myocardial infarction. The study is the Interheart study, where you remember that there were more than 25,000 people from 52 countries. Now, you would see on the right-hand panel that whichever country or continent you are in, the relationship is maintained. However, when you look at one of this very elegant imaging study which was presented recently, you'll find that even if there is only one risk factor or no risk factor, you have an evidence of inflammation in the vascular tree in 30 to 50% of subjects. And if you look at the atherosclerotic plaque, as has been diagnosed by or detected by the magnetic resonance imaging, you'll see that even in the absence of the risk factors, 80% of people have a presence of a plaque, and with one risk factor, 90% of the people have the presence of a plaque. So what's happening? Can we invoke the genetics here? And when we look at the genetics, whether you are at a low genetic risk, intermediate genetic risk, or high genetic risk, something which was presented with the 50 SNPs by Khera and Dr. Kathireshan's group from Mass General Hospital, you'll clearly see that yes, the genetics do contribute to the coronary artery disease, but there is a significant interaction with the environmental factors that even in a high-risk group, if you have a more prudent lifestyle, the risk is cut in less than half, suggesting thereby a close interaction of the genetics and the environmental factors. Now, the nuances here could be that if you look at the new proposal, which comes from Dr. Salim Yusuf's group, as has been the rank order of the top 10 risk factors in the cardiovascular disease in the high, middle, and low income countries, you'll see that obviously the older risk factors, they do remain important, but there are some other ones which emerge, and specifically when we relate it to the middle income countries like ours. For example, the air pollution takes over as one of the very important risk factors, and so is the low education, in addition to the hypertension and tobacco use. And obviously the other factors, they do remain, but these new factors could be one important nuance. The further nuances could be that it is not only the genetic mutations, could it be the somatic mutations which collect? And as we age, and we know that age is probably the most important risk factor when it comes to the coronary artery disease, some of the somatic mutation, for example, the one which has been proposed again from the Broad Institute in Mass General, that the CHIP or the clonal hematopoiesis of indeterminate potential, where you see that these somatic mutations, they collect over a period of time, and there are approximately 20% variance of the allelic frequencies by the age of 70. You'll see that they, in about less than 1% of cases, they would result in hematologic malignancies, but they increase the risk of the cardiovascular disease by more than 40%. Now, as was presented in that particular study, that if you look at the CHIP and the early onset of myocardial infarction, there was 4-fold higher likelihood of having an early myocardial infarction, approximately 2-fold higher likelihood of having the coronary artery disease, as these leukocytes, they start to collect into the atherosclerotic plaques. And even if you look at the coronary artery calcium scores, that if the allelic frequency was less than 0.10, there was essentially no increase in the risk. But as soon as the allelic frequencies start to exceed 0.10, you'll see that the risk becomes very significantly higher to have the coronary artery disease and to have the adverse coronary events. Now, if we really bring these risk factors down, as you would see in one of our studies, where we had looked at the Chimane population in Bolivia, where their LDL cholesterol levels have been between 30 to 70 when we did our first survey, you will see that they have the least amount of the coronary artery calcium, be it in their males or in their females. And you compare them to any population in the world, they have the lowest coronary artery calcium score. Again, adding to the hypothesis that it may be the cholesterol level that is significantly important. And if you look at various studies of the statins, that lower you go on the LDL cholesterol level, lower is the likelihood of having a coronary artery disease event. And now that you can add the PCSK9 on top of the statins, and as you know, that we can even achieve the levels of less than 25 milligram percent or even 15 milligram percent, something what we are born with, you are further able to reduce the disease substantially. Not only that, if you remember the Scott Hart trial, where there was a 5-year follow-up which was recently presented, you did see that the people who had their CT angiography based follow-up as compared to the standard care follow-up, the people with the CT angiography did better, even though there was no change in the percent of patients who underwent the invasive coronary angiography or underwent the coronary revascularization, but demonstrated a significantly superior outcome if the treatment was based or management was based on the CT angiography. And the reason being that these people were treated better because we were able to identify the non-atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. The rate of statin, etc., was much better, and they adhered to the preventive therapies much better. Although still the usage was less than a third of the people, even in this particular group. So you can imagine that if there is a prudent use of the preventive therapies, how improved the outcomes are likely going to be. So this was at the population level. What do I do if I have to go to the at a level of personalized medicine or here? And that is probably one of the nuance that Dr. Manoria wanted me to speak about. And as you know, that these are the plaques. Such plaques have very large necrotic codes. They have a huge plaque burden. They have got a significant amount of positive remodeling. And also in these areas, you see that there is an intense inflammation as shown here in this particular case. Can we identify these cases by the non-invasive imaging? So here is one of our earliest experiments with the CT angiography, where you are able to identify the positive remodeling as shown by the yellow arrows, and also that there is a presence of a very big necrotic core or a huge necrotic core, which can be seen as the low density plaque or low attenuation plaque. So we call these plaques, to become a little non-specific, we call these plaques as the two feature positive plaques, and the two features being the positive remodeling and the presence of the low attenuation plaque, which is clearly absent in the patients with the stable coronary artery disease. This is the patient who presented with unstable angina on the left-hand panel, and the patient who underwent PCI for the stable disease here. So this one was the two-feature negative plaque, and the one with the acute coronary syndrome was the patient with the two-feature positive plaque. And on our 2-year follow-up, every patient was followed for 2 years, more than 1,000 cases. You would see that there was 22.5 times higher likelihood of, 45 times higher likelihood of having an acute coronary event over the next 2 years as compared to people who had a two-feature negative plaque. And larger the plaque burden, larger the remodeling index, larger the plaque volume, larger the necrotic core volume, earlier was the event that occurred in these cases. And we also found that more the vulnerable plaque features or high-risk plaque feature, more is the likelihood of having an event. Now, in our subsequent study, where we had 3,000 patients and a follow-up of up to 10 years, you would see that this trend continues. The patients with the high-risk plaque, they do worse as compared to the non-high-risk plaques. However, in this particular period, The patients with the high-risk plaque also, they have a almost about 2% likelihood of having an event, suggesting thereby that over the next 10 years, some of these people are likely to develop a plaque, which is going to result in an event. And we also found, wherever we had an access to 2 scans, that the people who really resulted or eventually ended up in having a major adverse cardiac event, they were the one which showed the progression of their plaque, that the plaque burden increased and the necrotic core volume increased over a period of time. I can assure you that the people who have got the high-risk plaque, but they do not demonstrate the plaque progression, are likely not to have an event over a period of time, suggesting thereby that you have stalled their progression or stalled the progression of their high-risk features. And also, the more stenotic the plaque, more the plaque burden, more likely is the event rate when the plaques are the high-risk plaques here. So putting it all together with Dr. Ban Kwan Ku's group from South Korea, this paper is going to be published next month in JACC Imaging, where you would be seeing that we put all these features together and multiple iterations of were conducted, and we found that there were 25 important features. And when you put them into the dendrogram and start to segregate them, you find that there are 6 important features which could be vessel related or which could be the lesion related. And as you can see here, that this is the necrotic core volume for the vessel, the partial atheroma volume at the lesion site, the remodeling index, the plaque volume, and the location at the proximal LAD. And when you add 2 important features, that is the diameter stenosis of more than 50% and the FFR of less than 0.80, what do you see about the area under the curve? That essentially, when you look at the 50%, it is like flipping a coin, that just based on the anatomic lesion, your outcomes are not going to be affected as much as compared to when you have the FFR, the AUC is significantly improved and comes to more than 0.6 as compared to 0.5. And then if you add the morphology of the features here, that is the plaques with such 6 features, the total atheroma volume even goes up by yet another 0.10 and it becomes 0.7. Also, recently it has been demonstrated that by looking at the attenuation around the vessel, we are also able to see in the CT angiography the likelihood of inflammation, which correlates the perivascular inflammation, which correlates with the intraplaque imaging also. Now, just to end, can we really demonstrate that at the patient level also? Here is a subject. You will see he's a 72 years old male, was worried because his father had a massive MI at the age of 50. He's a CEO of a big firm up in Vancouver. And he comes with a chest pain, and we do the CT angiogram. Look at the drop in the FFR. There is a 0.76 drop in FFR. However, the lesion is less than 25% here. And as you can see, that this was possibly because of the presence of a huge necrotic core in this particular case. And then he wants to avoid the angiography. He was given the maximum dose of statins with ezetimibe, and 6 months later, you will see that his necrotic core has totally disappeared. The luminal size has not obviously changed, and you will see that the FFR here has improved remarkably, and the patient does not require anything, suggesting thereby that we can go at a lesional level and can intervene by pharmacologic intervention. And then came the study by Dr. Stone and Dr. David Erling. Actually, it's going to be published again next week in Lancet. And as you would see here in this Prospect 2 study, where there were 900 patients, of which 300 were randomized to receive the Absorb biovascular scaffold and were compared with the randomized with the guideline-directed medical therapy for a follow-up of 2 years, and those who were only on the guideline-directed therapy will be followed up to 15 years. And in this bioabsorbable stent arm, you would see that the outcome suggested that you were able to better maintain the lumen, as can be seen here in this right coronary artery, which had a huge lipid core burden index. And similarly, the one where the bioabsorbable stent was not placed, that artery was lost upon the follow-up of 2 years, suggesting thereby that if we are able to identify the lesions who are likely to have an event, we may be able to intervene with the interventional treatment also. So just 2 points to end my talk. Number one, that the plaque progression is an important thing, that we continue to collect the plaque through our life. So our prevention must start here. The primary prevention must start before the lesion is identified, and it all becomes a secondary prevention after that. We don't have to depend until the event has occurred to start our secondary prevention. So essentially, there has to be a plaque progression, and we will need to develop these strategies by which we can find that these are the plaques which are likely to result in an event. And the last important thing being here, that in this particular case, where we had done a stage study, where we have the intravascular ultrasound and near-infrared spectroscopy, you see the patients were maximized on statins, and there was a significant decrease in the lipid core burden index within the next 8 to 12 weeks time. And we look at their peripheral blood monocytes, and what we found was that between the earlier gene transcriptomic signature versus at the statin treatment, there were 6 distinct genes that we found, and we went a step further to find out that if we look at all these genes, would we be able to identify the patients who are likely to respond to statins as compared to those who are not likely to respond to these statins. So here are the non-responders and here are the responders, and there is a distinctive transcriptomic signature difference between the two groups. So would those be the cases where we should be starting PCSK9? Would those be the cases where we should go and intervene if we are able to identify the subjects who are likely to have an impending event? So I do hope, Dr. Manoria, that I have been able to present some of the nuances which may be able to give us a better outcome. Thank you. Dr. Manoria, you are muted.
Great talk. Enjoyed it. Dr. Narula, high calcium score in a de novo patient is associated with increased incidence of cardiovascular events, as you said. But the calcium score, when it increases because of statin therapy, there is a paradoxical effect. So why this paradoxical effect? And in a patient who is already on statin, is it possible by imaging to differentiate which calcification is de novo and which calcification is statin induced?
As always, Dr. Manoria, every question of yours is $1 million question. Absolutely. And this paradox is extremely important. In absence of the statins, we are talking about the calcification as a representation of or as a surrogate marker of the presence of atherosclerosis. That in the plaque, if the macrophage death is occurring, it works as a nidus where the hydroxyapatite starts to deposit and the calcification evolves from there. Upon statins, we are also causing the death of the macrophages. So in the previous one, where we did not have the statins, it basically was only representing the significance of the large necrotic cores. However, after giving the statins, the necrotic core has been completely replaced by calcification. So there is nothing which is going to be resulting in an event. And as a matter of fact, when with these statins there is calcification, it becomes protective. However, in about 2 to 3% of cases, and you will be seeing this paper which will be coming out in exactly about 2 weeks. In Jack, it is from Dr. Virmani's group. And fortunately, I was able to write an editorial on that particular paper that there is about 2 to 3% of cases where there is too much of a calcification, and that calcification results in calcific nodules which pierce through which fragment and pierce through the fibrous cap, even when the fibrous cap is very thick, and they lead to the events, but it is only about 2 to 3% of cases. Why does that happen? She has tried to characterize only about 27 lesions, which they have demonstrated out of a registry of 600 people. And what they demonstrate is that if these arteries are tortuous, and it is at the knee of that tortuosity that the calcific nodule sits, and that calcific nodule has to be enveloped or nestled in the necrotic core so that it is in a softer environment. There is a gradient of the tensile strength. So, and on the sides, there is a significant calcification or calcific plates. So when they squeeze it out, quite like आप लीची में से जैसे गिठली निकाल देते हैं, quite like that the whole thing will just come out as a fragmented thing, pushes through the fibrous cap and can result in an event. So yes, number one, that calcification, when it is a microcalcification in the thin fibrous cap associated with large necrotic core, this is a harbinger of sudden death and acute myocardial infarction. When there is a calcification present in necrotic core, it is likely to result in a to tell you that there is a significant atherosclerosis. But when you give statins, it is a feature of stability. But can imaging identify them? For now, until now, no. Would that be a possibility? Maybe.
I think we would have loved to have this session for a long time, but because of time constraints, we are moving to the second session. Thank you, Dr. Tailani, and thank you, Dr. Zainab.
Thank you.
The second esteemed faculty for this conference is Dr. Ravi Kasliwal. Dr. Ravi Kasliwal, as you know, is Chairman Division of Clinical and Preventive Cardiology, Community Outreach Program at the Medanta, the Medicity Gurugram. He's President of South Asian Society of Atherosclerosis and Thrombosis and past President IAE. He's Adjunct Professor of Cardiology, NBE. He mentors Diplomat National Board of Cardiology. He also mentors physicians from India and abroad in the field of echocardiography and preventive cardiology. And he has received several awards and orations, including the B.C. Roy National Award, and he has 350 publications to his credit. He is the founder, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Clinical and Preventive Cardiology, and also applied echocardiography in coronary artery disease. I'll hand over the session to Dr. Neeti Raja and Dr. Amrish to conduct the session. Dr. Amrish, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Monoria. And it's a pleasure for me to head this session. And this session, as you know, Dr. Ravi Kasliwal is speaking, and Dr. Monoria has given a very excellent introduction for it. We had a chance to meet for some time together. I remember a long time back, like 10 years back, we were together in a meeting in Alexandria. So Dr. Ravi, welcome. And today he's going to speak on evolving world of cardio-oncology, improving outcomes, a totally tangential topic from Dr. Narula has alluded now, certainly before. This cardio-oncology is a topic which is now coming in a force by itself, because as the population increasing, more people having cancers, more people receiving chemotherapeutic agents, and many of these chemotherapeutic agents are having actually a detrimental effect on the heart. So we as a cardiologist, we are putting this follow for these patients. We are doing this research, and we are deciding when some time down the line we will interrupt the oncology therapy for this patient. So Dr. Kasliwal, please welcome.
Thank you very much for the very kind invitation. Dr. Monoria, thank you very much for selecting January 23rd for your conference. As you know, this is the 125th anniversary of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and my father was his personal physician. So this day has a special meaning to me. The evolving world of cardio-oncology is what you wanted me to talk about, improving outcomes. And excuse me. I have names, the next lady.
So you just have to click on your screen and then try changing the
Let's start
slide.
with a small case history. This is a 45 years old lady. She's obese, hypertensive, dyslipidemic, diagnosed with invasive ductal carcinoma of the breast, received epirubicin for 3 months on the oncology team. And we work very closely together, actually, medical and radiotherapy oncology. We all work together. Oncology team planned to start trastuzumab on this lady and refer to cardiology for baseline. So if you look at the ejection fraction here, it is 60%, and the global longitudinal strain is minus 22%, which is normal. And while on trastuzumab, she developed the ejection fraction continued to be good. The LVEF, SV, and it's one of the most important parameters in cardiology today. But the global longitudinal strain decreased to minus 18.7. After 3 months of trastuzumab, LVEF, no significant reduction, but there was a reduction in the global longitudinal strain, 16% reduction. And we thought this is the right time to start actually beta blockers and during chemotherapy. And, you know, these are young people. They should not, the cardiac angle should not cause a distress to them. That is my basic thing when I look at these patients. And after 1 year after completion of therapy, we found that there was a protective effect, and we'll come to that. But certainly, this brings into sharp focus the role of the cardiologist, the clinical cardiologist, and the oncologist in looking after these very sick patients. So the evolving role of cardio-oncology, cancer and CVD, we know many cancers affect the heart directly. Many cancer drugs produce cardiotoxicity. Pre-existing CVD versus now. As in the COVID task force, I had also created the same kind of matrix here, that those cancer patients who had no risk factors for cardiac disease, those who had risk factors for CVD but no overt CVD, and those who actually had ASCVD, and they behave differently. So what is cardio-oncology? We look at cardiovascular risk factors, we look at treatment-related cardiotoxicity, and we can then look at cancer biology and look at the disease and see how we can help these patients out. Cardiotoxicity of cancer drugs is well known, but obviously on the other side, they have very good effects on the cancer for which this patient is getting treatment. So anthracyclines, anthraquinones, myocardial ischemia, 5-fluorouracil, pericarditis, thrombophilia, arrhythmias. So if you look at it, there is a wide spectrum of disease which can be caused by cancer drugs. Heart disease, but looking at literature many years ago, I found out this very nice article in Circulation. Heart disease and cancer, are the two killers colluding? That was the question asked by the authors. There are common molecular pathways, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and they both play a central role in the pathophysiology of cardiovascular disease. And if you look at the risk factors, age, gender, genetics, tobacco, it just appears as if when we talk of CVD, we are actually also talking of cancers of many types: sedentary lifestyle, unhealthy diets, environmental exposures, chronic inflammation, oxidative stress. So to me, there are synergistic opportunities in the interplay between cancer screening and disease risk assessment, because I sit on the chair of clinical and preventive cardiology, and I think both of them move in the same way. Now, current myocardial diseases, heart failure, asymptomatic LV dysfunction, we'll have to deal with all of these when they develop, and as the populations are living longer, you will see that obviously cancer incidence, LV dysfunction incidence, all these things will increase. Amongst the proposed diagnostic, what should we do? I think the most important thing is the physician, the cardiologist having a good look to the patient, talking to them. That is one thing very important. Of course, we will take recourse with an ECG or a chest X-ray or a left ventricular ejection fraction, which has emerged very importantly, and a global longitudinal strain, as Tom Marwick and our group have been talking about. But essentially, we will have to, in our mind, have this matrix in our mind. Is this gentleman, is this lady having side effect, having risk factors, no risk factors, or is already known case of ASCVD, and everything will then emanate. I use in our cardio-oncology service, we use cardiac biomarkers, troponins and high-sensitive troponin and BNP very regularly. And for prognosticating and phenotyping, the role of echocardiography is immense. And that is not the purpose of this interaction today, but just to say that many of our patients are now demanding, sir, you haven't done my echo this time. The echo parameters that we look at, of course, LVEF, we look at global longitudinal strain. And I was just reading the other day in the JACC that diastolic function parameters are also important. And they said that many ladies with breast cancers actually had diastolic dysfunction. Stress echocardiography we use, and of course, myocardial strain imaging we use for every patient now. If they, in LVEF, if it is partially reversible, it improves by 10 percentage points from the Nadir, and remaining 5 percentage points below baseline. People will ask, am I improving or not? So we'll have to see whether the problem that we've created by the cancer drugs, is it reversible? Is it partially reversible? Is it irreversible? Or it is indeterminate? And that's very easy to follow now with left ventricular ejection fraction. Global longitudinal strain, it is said that it's more than 15% relative percentage reduction from baseline actually suggests cardiotoxicity. And we have also been rewarded by doing systolic function, and we are working on that, and we can definitely find RV systolic dysfunction in many patients. Now, all chemotherapeutic agents, the potential cardioprotective measures are also there. And for example, anthracyclines, which are so commonly used, we talk to our medical oncology people. In fact, they say if the patient has discovered dysfunction, they can decrease the dose or they can change the medication. So this can only occur if there is a close dialogue between 2 or 3 people on a cycle-to-cycle basis. And of course, we found that ACE inhibitors and beta blockers generally and statins have been extremely good in this. For example, I was impressed by the Circulation paper many years ago, prevention of high-dose chemotherapy-induced cardiotoxicity in high-risk patients of angiotensin converting by ACE inhibitors. And this is a paper by Dr. Tom Harvey, a good friend of mine. 318 patients on cancer chemotherapy and trastuzumab therapy showed significant associations with incident heart failure independent of anthracycline-related cardiotoxicity. But they say that continuous use of a beta blocker was associated with a lower risk of new heart failure events. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We will have to look at it in the Indian context, and many of us need to get together and actually do our own work at this level. Statins always come into the play. Statins significantly reduce the risk of new onset heart failure in this particular study, but I'm not sure. Maybe we'll have to do more work on this level. But the primary prevention trials in patients with early stage breast cancer, for example, the PRADA study or the Manticore study, these studies were in a sense formed the basis of our own work generally in cardio-oncology. And sorry?
Dr. Kasliwal, 2 minutes left.
No, I could end at this point. There's no problem.
You can continue for another 2 minutes.
So let me get down to saying that of the 202 patients who had echo done before chemotherapy, we had 184 patients. And out of these, we could do another echo for 125 patients. And some people whose ejection fractions had fallen. We then did, and we are now doing GLS in most of them. And we found that some of them actually showed improvement. So there is a sense in doing regular, keeping them under follow-up, particularly those who have those who are high-risk individuals. And my own feeling is that I have data of almost 370 patients, that those patients who have decreased LVEF or global longitudinal strain, particularly, these patients did well on therapy. and they could continue the thing for which they had come for. I mean, it would be very unlikely, very bad for these patients if we did not let them continue. So cancers and CVD are interlinked. This is my conclusion, both in terms of direct pathological involvement as well as therapy-related outcomes. Close coordination. Obviously, cardiologists and oncologists need to deliver optimum care to these patients. Neuroechocardiographic techniques, and we are doing them routinely. At the same time, many cardiac drugs can help prevent cardiac toxicity. So Dr. Manoria, thank you very much. Dr. Agarwal, thank you very much for giving me these 12 minutes. This is ongoing work at the Cardio Oncology Clinic in Medanta. We have young people involved, and we have a good setup. And maybe by next year, we'll be able to give you more data. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best for your conference.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ravi. And I mean, we know that the GLS nowadays is coming in 4, particularly for oncology patients. But in your practice, in your center, how are you integrating if somebody has got early dysfunction, which is not at all apparent on the traditional radiotherapy, and the GLS showed a drop, like you showed in the previous patient? What you would do? Would you do a repeat follow-up after 4 weeks time? Would you look for measurable inconsistencies? Or would you start treatment for the anti-affiliate treatment right away? Or would you change the chemotherapy dose? How will you integrate in your practice?
Yes, this is a very good question. Actually, a lot of questions involved in this. First of all, for all our cardio-oncology patients now, for the last 2 years, we will definitely do their global longitudinal strain along with left ventricular ejection fractions. And in those patients who are at high risk, definitely, if they're tachycardic and the blood pressure allows us, definitely we will start them on ACE inhibitors or beta blockers. Many studies done by other individuals with several years ago have shown that these have good effects. I'm always in touch with Dr. Webb because they know which are the high-risk individuals, and then we quantify them from cardiology standpoint. This works together, and I think we'll be able to. Many patients have completed their cycles just because they were protected by cardioprotective drugs, and there were eyes and ears listening to it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal. Really appreciate your comments. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Lecture, we move on to the next session. And the next session is on a very interesting topic, unraveling the evolving mystery of P2Y12 receptor in ACS. And the speaker for this session is no other person but Dr. Hazra. Dr. Prakash Hazra is an unmatched super specialist with great thoughts. He is currently Director Cath Lab, Emory Hospital, Kolkata, MDDM PGI Chandigarh, Proctor of LA, Occluder and Micra, 25 years experience in interventional cardiology, and is expert in various interventions, TAVR, RDN, his bundle pacing, stroke, PAD, heart failure, device, etc. Pediatric interventions like prostate, pediatric and other interventions like prostate and visceral interventions. I'll request Dr. Pankaj and Aziz Khan to chair this session.
Good evening, sir. Thank you, Dr. Manoria, for inviting us on this conference. We are coming to a very important topic today, as Dr. Manoria said, antiplatelet therapy. They form the mainstay of therapy in management of ACS. We had clopidogrel, then we had prasugrel, then we had ticagrelor, and which drug to use in patients on medical therapy for PCA and CABG. Which drug is better, which have less bleeding complications and decreased ischemic events. For that, we have very eminent speaker, Dr. Hazra. So may I invite Dr. Hazra to start his talk?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So we are in 2021, and what are the things are handed over to 2021? And in terms of antiplatelet, we have Tyco, Twilight complex PCI, Twilight diabetes, Populodase, Alpheus, Taylor PCI, on-time Lodoco, etc., ischemia trial, precombationiers, Synthes code, and many other things has been published in 2020, and actually we are getting better and better every day. But as far the DAPT concept goes, it did not come from any university. It came from one lady, that is Madame Marie-Claude Maurice, and it's from France, and 2,900 patients coming from 25 French centers between 1992 to 1995. And they have demonstrated that if you use double antiplatelet on the top of aspirin, your stent thrombosis rate goes down. So what started from Claude Maurice with your ticlopidine, then clopidogrel, then prasugrel, then your ticagrelor. So this is the timeline of antiplatelets. ASA produced in commercial basis, on commercial basis in 1897, 1974 first in AMI, 1988, and is a super molecule. It still holds good in many ACS patients. But the recent study has put some doubt about the durations, and it has been dropped in all studies of atrial fibrillation with ACS. Now, 2021, we have a SMART DAPT. The year before, as I mentioned, these are the trial, but don't get confused with ACS versus non-ACS like chronic coronary syndrome with GIANTS 28, GIANTS 90, Onyx 1. And you know, this is a beautiful journey of aspirin, and in secondary prevention, it has a place, but that has a top-secret recourse roller coaster ride with aspirin primary prevention. So since the topic is ACS, some of these patients will go into medical arm. They may not require any stent or CABG. So perhaps that is the best and cheapest molecule in the treatment of ACS. Now, in STEMI, Clarity and Comet from China, large number of patients, the clopidogrel makes its entry, 300 milligram. Then we have this kind of, again, newer molecule like rivaroxaban in the terms of, in the field of ACS, but in terms of hemorrhage, it did increase the incidence of hemorrhage when you gone from 2.5 to 5 milligram of EO rivaroxaban. So that's why the newer trial in chronic coronary syndrome, when the transition from acute coronary syndrome to chronic coronary syndrome goes, we go down to 2.5 milligram of rivaroxaban. And look at this CURE trial within 24 hours. This is not 1 day, 2 day, 1 year, 10 years, 5 years, 25 years study. This is CURE 24 hours. Within 24 hours, see the difference. In the hospital, there is 34% reductions of stent thrombosis and relative risk reduction. So it does work. It works very significant way. And now what we know after having a network meta-analysis of 52,000 patients from 12 randomized clinical trial between these three molecules, prasugrel, clopidogrel, and ticagrelor. So what we have learned in 2021, that if you compare prasugrel versus clopidogrel in ACS, prasugrel, as far as the mortality is concerned, not very significant. MI, very significant. Stent thrombosis, very, very significant over clopidogrel. So prasugrel is the winner. Ticagrelor versus clopidogrel. Ticagrelor is the winner because it does reduce all-cause mortality, cardiovascular mortality, and cardiovascular death. So this superiority coming from cardiovascular mortality. MI, not so good. Stent thrombosis, okay, is good, but not better than prasugrel. But when you compare prasugrel versus ticagrelor, like I said, REACT, cardiovascular mortality, you get no benefit. If you go for non-fatal MI, you get benefits. Stent thrombosis is definitely superior than your ticagrelor. So one size does not fit all. If you have a bleeding, elderly, HB or ACS, try to remain with clopidogrel. It's a good drug. Go for imaging. Go for durable polymer DES like GIANTS or Onyx. Medically treated ACS, clopidogrel will as good as any other regime like aspirin, clopidogrel for 12 months. Cardiovascular mortality is coming from ticagrelor. MI reductions coming from prasugrel, not from ticagrelor. Stent thrombosis, prasugrel is superior. If you have economy, once in a day issue, dyspnea, you can switch back to clopidogrel or prasugrel, or can remain with prasugrel or clopidogrel throughout your life. So what are the game changers from clopidogrel to ticagrelor? Because of, as I mentioned, CV mortality, all-cause death, but no MI reductions, stent reductions, stent thrombosis reductions, non-CABG blood increased. It was a game changer. But when you gone for clopidogrel to prasugrel in the previous trial, what we have learned? We have learned that it did not change the mortality. I'm repetitive here, non-fatal MI reduction plus, stent thrombosis reduction plus, bleeding increase, but only in PCI. economic advantage once in a day, and no dyspnea, no heart block. Ticagrelor versus prasugrel, there is no change in mortality, as I mentioned. Then there is a controversy with the duration. I think the BMS was a very good stent as far as the safety part is concerned, but we did a historical mistake by stopping antiplatelet, the BAPT, at 4 weeks. When you compare to the giants in ACS, there is more stent thrombosis in BMS, but if the stent thrombosis is an issue, we should have continued BAPT for a longer period of time. So again, this journey or this timeline again is topsy-turvy, roller coaster. But as far as the guideline goes, it goes for 1 year in all ACS. The guideline has not changed in spite of having solid data after data, trial after trial, and we are also advancing in other fields. But the ACS remains the bone of contentions or the area where the maximum mortality happens. And we started with Theo, then Triton, then Plato, Atlas ACS I mentioned, and ICSDX5. So let me also say a little bit of CAS or chronic coronary syndrome. 12-month ideal DPD duration is still in guideline. 3 months ticagrelor, then ASA, then ticagrelor monotherapy, it can be done. 1 month prasugrel with aspirin, then 11-month aspirin plus 5 milligram of prasugrel, tapering down, or de-escalation of prasugrel can be done. 3-month prasugrel plus aspirin, then prasugrel only in PCIS patient can be a choice. Usable durable polymer, we have learned from host-reduced Polytech ACS is better than your biodegradable polymer like your Ultimaster or BioFreedom like stent. Imaging is essential. In more than 70 years, you can go for clopidogrel. So recent trial, Twilight trial, is also opened up new things. Like we know that you can shorten the DAPT, you can de-escalate, you can withdraw aspirin. But where are the data? The data is coming from Twilight in ACS patients, but Twilight has also a little bit of problem because 21% failed to randomize and 21% dropout rates with medication and 10% anticipated. In AF field, the verdict is quite clear that you need only one antiplatelet, clopidogrel, plus a NOAC. And there are a lot of old trials is being discussed in 2020, but I tell you, these are the trials where the BMS was used in 42%, and BMS does cause more stent thrombosis than giants. Prasugrel, BMS 48%, and bleeding is an issue. So you should fall back on new trials like host-reduced 2020, Popular ACE, Twilight, and ICSDX5. And what we have learned in Popular ACE in non-semi 2020, in non-semi only, and we have learned that perhaps if you stay with clopidogrel in elderly, it is non-inferior, perhaps superior to some extent than ticagrelor prasugrel regime. We also have learned from host-reduced Polytech ACS that changing the polymer, I mean, if you go for this durable polymer, as I said, like giants, you can have better outcome. Host-reduced Polytech ACS, ACS PCI eligible patient, prasugrel de-escalation strategy is also another arm where it has been shown that 10 milligram prasugrel plus 1 month of aspirin, then aspirin 75 milligram, and de-escalation of prasugrel 5 milligram is as good as many other trials in the past which has been done with prasugrel, but that dose was 10 milligram. Low bleeding rate, but no increase in ischemic events and stent thrombosis. And there are issues with net clinical benefit, and NNH ratio always goes in favor of the newer molecule and should not bother about this ratio. But what the theme is, if you stay for shorter duration of life, if you exclude high bleeding risk patient, if you do imaging, if you do not have a complex PCI patient, in ACS patient, along with PCSK9, along with statin, beta blocker, your ARNI can reduce total mortality, especially in diabetic, we use GLP-1 and SGLT2. So ICSReact has opened another chapter, ticagrelor versus prasugrel in ACS, but it is one country, two countries in Germany and Netherlands, open label, methodological concern, discontinuation is more with ticagrelor. But what you have learned in ICSReact 2005, in ICSReact 5 for 4,000 patients, it does reduce cardiovascular death, but not significant. But MI was reduced significantly with prasugrel, and the bleed is not that what we have seen in the past. So TICO-ACS is another thing. It is basically has divided in 3 groups: STEMI, non-STEMI, non-stable angina. The theme is like global leaders and twilight, and the outcome is almost same. So ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude here that clopidogrel, ticagrelor, or prasugrel, one size does not fit in all ACS. De-escalation in terms of dose, durations, and numbers of antiplatelets are intuitive and provocative, but it works in some group of people, but beyond guideline. The guideline still stays with 12 months, and ticagrelor and prasugrel at equal footing after the ICI REACT 5, game of atrial fibrillation of doing PCI in ACS almost drawn to conclusion, but plays still on in sinus rhythm, safety and efficacy and equipoise with ticagrelor, prasugrel, and clopidogrel, especially in elderly. Thank you for kind attention.
Congratulations, Dr. Hajra, for unraveling this mystery of P2Y2 inhibitor. But still, Dr. Hajra, there's a lot of confusion because on the one hand, we are talking about reducing the duration of DAPT with the TOLITE trial, TICO trial, the global leader, and the STOP DAPT and other trials. But on the other hand, we are discussing about prolonging DAPT with the DAPT study, the PEGASUS study, and also the COMPASS study, in which adding another antithrombotic regime. So what the message should we go to the physicians, whether we should prolong the duration of DAPT or should cut down the DAPT duration?
Okay, so there are 2 territories. One is ACS, another is chronic coronary syndrome. I'm sure if the ACS do not die, they have to go into CCS territory one day, especially when you have fixed their coronary and vulnerable plaque with your medicine, your statin, your PCSK9, SGLT receptor, etc. So if it is a chronic coronary syndrome, after 1 month, if you have a multiple stent, high-risk patients, if you have CKD, if you have post-CABG patients, these are the patients should be switched to 2.5 milligram rivaroxaban. There is no doubt, because it does reduce cardiovascular mortality. So it is better to leave or go with COMPASS way rather than living with PEGASUS way. So PEGASUS did not show any cardiovascular mortality reductions. So death is important. Death is monotropic. You can have bleeding nuisance and you can have bleeding due to many drugs, but many sources. But these are many times can kill some people, but maybe it is a nuisance. So CV mortality is reduced only by rivaroxaban. I'll go for rivaroxaban, and that is a game changer. And I'm really convinced about this strategy. I'm practicing that.
But they say if there's a history of myocardial infarction, and then the balance shifts towards and DAPT, to prolonging DAPT rather than adding rivaroxaban. If there's no history of MI, recent MI, and then we should add rivaroxaban, they say. Presence of,
I think that after 12 months, as you have raised, is become a little bit confusing to the physician. You have diabetic THEMIS trial, you have this COMPASS trial, you have PEGASUS 54 trial, and you have smart DAPT trial also. So there are many choices, but to be very honest, I have gone through the meta-analysis. I would say that aspirin, rivaroxaban 2.5 milligram twice in a day after 12 months. Up to 3 months, you can stay with ticagrelor aspirin, your prasugrel aspirin, clopidogrel aspirin. 3 to 12 months, guideline says stay with your guideline-directed medical therapy. But that is also another chapter, another area where this rivaroxaban can have an entry in the future, but there is no data.
Thank you, Dr. Hajra, for the wonderful lecture. Thank you, Dr. Pankaj and Dr. Aziz Khan. We now move on to the next session. And the speaker for the next session is Dr. Alka Deshpande. She is President-elect, Association of Physicians of India. She's a consultant physician, ex-professor, head Department of Medicine, Grant Medical College, JJ Hospital, Mumbai. 120 publications in various national and international journals. He has authored 8 books, contribution to several textbooks, and a recipient of Padma Shri in 2001. I'll request Dr. Ved Prakash Pandey and Alok Rai to conduct this session.
Sir. Hi. Good evening, everyone. Am I audible, Dr. Manoria, sir?
Yes.
Go ahead. Good evening. It's truly a wonderful evening to me and all for having Dr. Alka Deshpande for this wonderful session. And one of the pioneer AIDS trainer at national level and a scientist par excellent at international level Dr. Alka Deshpande would definitely be doing the excellent justice with the topic that is management of AIDS, what is happening today with the AIDS therapy. So over to Dr. Alka Deshpande at this.
Thank you, Chairpersons, and I thank Dr. Manoria and his organizing team for this kind invite to me. The topic is AIDS, key messages for physicians in today's context. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we have more than 2 million HIV positive patients in India. Government of India started free antiretroviral therapy since April 2004. And therefore, I have divided my talk as pre-COVID scenario, COVID scenario in the early stages, and now COVID and HIV co-infection. 40%, I did a quick survey of our ART centers in Mumbai, and I found that 40% of the patients are on ART for more than 15 years. That means their longevity is increased, and at present they are in the age group of 45 to 59 years. So along with HIV, now as they are aging, they are developing various lifestyle disorders, including diabetes, hypertension, and coronary artery disease. ARV increases the coronary heart disease risk in these people. It's mainly because of protease inhibitors like atazanavir, lopinavir, darunavir, etc., which causes dyslipidemias. It's one of the side effects of this drug. And these dyslipidemias are responsible for increased CHD risk. Acute coronary syndromes are seen in young HIV patients. Another interesting fact is that higher rates of stent-related complications, more to the tune of 30%, are seen in these people. Why am I talking about these conditions to the physicians? Are these the key issues? Yes, because the medical officers in the ART center are trained only to deliver the ART as per the national protocols. So they are not in a position to identify and manage these conditions, maybe non-communicable diseases or other conditions. I would like to draw your attention to these two interesting conditions, primary pulmonary hypertension and dilated cardiomyopathy. Primary pulmonary hypertension increasingly recognized complication since 1987. 1,000-fold more common in HIV patients, male predominance and younger age group. The mortality is 50% at 1 year. So patients with this condition have to be identified by the physicians and managed. Similar cases with dilated cardiomyopathy. 10% of HIV patients come with dilated cardiomyopathy. HIV per se, other secondary infecting agents and nutritional deficiencies contribute to this dilated cardiomyopathy. But in addition, recently it has been shown that there is a cytokine imbalance. The pro-inflammatory cytokines are increased. Also, there is a role of autoimmunity, as they have shown anti-alpha myosin autoantibodies. And therefore, 10% cases will come with dilated cardiomyopathy. So that will be also a key issue for the physicians to manage in these HIV patients. So this was about the pre-COVID scenario. Another thing is, despite treatment advances, cognitive disorders have continued to affect a large percentage of people living with AIDS, adversely affecting their lives and frustrating their loved ones as well as healthcare providers. So we have to remember and manage these patients along with their cognitive disorders. Now, scenario 2 is when we started lockdown. The first report started trickling about the corona infection in India in January 2020. It was an evolving pandemic. Even today, we have not fully understood that SARS-CoV-2 virus, how it behaves, what is the pathogenesis, what exactly is the treatment, but this was evolving. In many countries, it had become a national emergency and medical management was crucial. This pandemic severely interrupted HIV care delivery. Many countries converted ART centers for COVID management. In Egypt, all the ART centers were converted to COVID management, which petrified the HIV patients to go and collect their refills of ART. 60 to 70% ART centers in Eastern and Central Europe were converted for COVID management. All the attention, personnel and resources were diverted to COVID. Workforce was diverted, mobilized for COVID. At the same time, medical consignments were stuck in procurement, and therefore there was shortage of drugs. It has been reported in the literature, recent literature, that 19% of HIV patients were unable to get their ART refills. NACO had instructed the Indian patients that they should go to the nearest ART center and procure their drugs. However, I don't have the data, neither NACO has undertaken this study, which will be worth finding out how many patients could reach the nearest ART center and get their refill. There were problems with transportation. The shops were closed, so patients couldn't buy the drugs. Of course, they are expensive. Monitoring of patients was difficult for retroviral disease as well as non-communicable diseases. From 2 centers, what I have seen after in last 2 months is that there are quite a few patients with CD4 decline and therapy failure. It may be because the therapy was interrupted for 6 to 7 months, and these are the people who are now developing HIV drug resistance. So this was the scenario with lockdown. And now I come to the third scenario, and that is HIV and COVID in the co-infection. As SARS-CoV-2 pandemic was unfolding, it reminded me of 1990 when I started my first dedicated outpatient for HIV/AIDS. There was a lot of stigmatization. There was panic, uncertainty, and fear of death. And all of you must have experienced the same in the beginning of COVID infection in India. Lot of stigmatization, panic, uncertainty, and fear of death because everything was uncertain. Okay. Coming to the diagnostic test, when we started the diagnostic test for HIV, in the beginning, of course, there was reluctance to get tested. Now, in case of HIV, it was something a little different because the HIV has a prolonged incubation period. Large number, the patients for the first 7 to 8 years are asymptomatic. Therefore, they don't seek a medical advice. Testing for HIV also meant admitting the risk behavior. Initially, a single test was done, and that was to be confirmed by Western blot. Interpretation of this test initially was very difficult because Western blot was not easily available. Interpretation of Western blot was not well defined, and large number of the test reports that we used to get as indeterminate. And we didn't know then how to approach the patient, whether to declare him as positive or negative. Similar thing is also happening in SARS-CoV. There is reluctance on the part of the individuals to get tested, but the reasons are different. In the initial period, all the patients who were tested positive or persons who were tested positive, they were sent to the quarantine centers. The quarantine centers were evolving, and therefore initially they lacked all the infrastructures, not at all comfortable, conducive and cooperative for the patients. There was a lot of social stigma. The families were boycotted. The families were literally harassed in housing societies. And also, lastly, there was a dilemma of interpretation. First of all, the technique of sample collection, whether the people were really trained properly. I have the reports that most of our medical residents didn't know how to use PPEs. Then the technique of collection of the samples. Initially, it was okay, only 1 or 2 centers were doing it. But then as the pandemic started increasing and more patients started coming, there was a technical difficulty in collecting the samples. Second thing, the time frame. Many a times, all other tests for the clinical picture of COVID will be positive and the RT-PCR will be negative because it was outside the time frame of 7 to 10 days. And therefore, if it is PCR is negative, the person would question you how my other tests are positive. CT scans, the CRP and ferritin and all other things. So there was a dilemma of interpretation, and then came corona antigen test. That again added to the confusion. So the dilemma is still unresolved. Of course, most of the people, the medical fraternity, by experience have now learned how to interpret these tests. One single report I came across from Singapore of cross-reactivity between COVID and HIV antibody. They were testing patients with fever and upper respiratory tract infection simultaneously for HIV and COVID. 2 patients were positive for both. The further testing showed that HIV was false positive. Now, Klieger and his colleague have shown via sequence analysis that HIV and SARS-CoV viral proteins shared a sequence motif and certain degree of homology in their proteins. And therefore, there was cross-reactivity. Therefore, if you find a COVID patient with HIV infection, HIV positive for the first time, please don't interpret it as positive unless it is confirmed by other tests, or the best would be a DNA PCR test. Coming to the COVID risk for people living with HIV/AIDS, the data is scarce. We really don't have the data because all our medical force was busy managing the COVID patients, and therefore there was no time to carry out the research work or trials or studies. So data is not enough. Immunodeficiency, we at least expected that immunodeficiency of HIV patient may increase the vulnerability to COVID. 2 large studies in UK, which shows that PLHA had 63 to 130% higher risk of dying from COVID. But that doesn't mean vulnerability because there were large number of patients who were not tested or asymptomatic. So the 63% higher risk of dying from COVID, it is further contributed by comorbidities, and this is important, that it was contributed by comorbidities. They also reported low CD4 count increased the mortality. That means immunodeficiency increased the mortality. As against this, a large US study did not find increased risk of severe illness when there is a co-infection. So we are still confused. We have not resolved this. Now, this is a single paper from India. It is a retrospective record-based case series from South India. And they could find only 6 cases of co-infection. One was ART naive, one was therapy failure. However, 5 cases had mild symptoms, one was asymptomatic. So what we anticipated that HIV immunodeficient people will be more vulnerable and they will have severe or serious COVID is not coming true. Median age of these patients was 38 years, CD4 was 535. So there was no really immune deficiency. Maybe because they were on ART, and all these patients recovered. But this is a single paper which I could find. More and more work we will need because we already have more than 2 million positive cases, HIV positive cases in India. Now, this is another report that I could find. PLHAs with SARS-CoV-2. UK reported 101 cases, USA 122, Spain 56, Germany 33. And as you can see, South Africa, which is the epicenter of HIV, has reported only 1 case of co-infection. Maybe lack of documentation, maybe the lack of manpower or whatever, but there is only 1 patient.
Dr. Alka, 2 minutes left.
Yes, 237 cases had at least 1 comorbid condition. 244 cases on prior ART, and they were well controlled with viral copies less than 50. What was the observation? Age group 40 to 59, they 82% recovery and 14% expired. But this case fatality is in the hospitalized patient. Naturally, these hospitalized patients had severe disease as well as there were more than 1 comorbidities. Now, this is something interesting that initially the patients who were coming with co-infection, these patients were on ART, including tenofovir, lopinavir, occasionally remdesivir, and therefore they showed these are the drugs which showed anti-COVID activity in vitro. The SARS-CoV infection may not be serious, and it was thought that it was at least attributed to the use of these drugs, but till today, these drugs have not been shown to have anti-COVID action in vivo. Immune suppression may be protective against severe clinical manifestations. Activation of immune system, especially T cells, enhances lung injury. It was Jube et al., in addition to lung histopathology, found hyperactivated state of peripheral CD4 cells with increased concentration of highly pro-inflammatory CCR6 and Th17 in CD4. possibly responsible for diffuse alveolar damage. So his hypothesis was that if HIV is causing immune suppression, that may be protective against these cytokine storms and will be protective for these lung conditions. So the conclusion from this case data, I would say that anticipated vulnerability, morbidity, and mortality in co-infection is not validated. Reports do not show excess morbidity, mortality, which is largely determined by age of the patient, comorbidities, and control of HIV. Mortality variability is based on ethnicity. It varies from country to country. So ethnicity, health facilities available in that country, and documentation of these cases. Clinical course is similar in HIV and non-HIV patient, and therefore management also remains similar. Only one guideline, VIVA, says that CD4 count may fall during COVID-19. If it is less than 200, then chemoprophylaxis to be started. So this is what I wanted to share with you. We require more and more work and more data to come to certain conclusions and validate our finding. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam, for the excellent observations and your experience on the subject. It was a wonderful presentation. Because of lack of time, I close this scientific session and hand over the session to Professor Manoria.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. The next session is by no other person but Dr. Naveen C. Nanda.
I think I started my slide.
Just a minute. Just a minute, sir.
Okay.
Dr. Naveen C. Nanda, all of us know, is a distinguished professor of medicine and cardiovascular disease, University of Alabama at the Birmingham, Alabama, USA. He is hailed as father of echocardiography, father of modern echocardiography by many prestigious organizations and societies because of pioneering work in adult, pediatric, fetal, and peripheral ultrasound. Echocardiography labs and institutions have been named after him in India, and he is the founding and the current president of International Society of Cardiovascular Ultrasound. I'd like to hand over the session to Dr. Josna and Dr. Rakesh Jalota to conduct this session. Dr. Josna. Dr. Josna, you are muted.
Yeah, good evening, sir, to everyone. I'm really delighted to chair this session because I'm able to directly interact with Dr. Naveen C. Nanda. So, sir is going to now talk about the left ventricular assessment. So, can I request the sir to start the presentation?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's a really great pleasure and honor for me to be here, and I appreciate very much the invitation from Dr. Manoria to speak here. And I think I can advance my slides. Okay, I think it's okay now. Okay, well, when it comes to echocardiography and looking at systolic function, we always think in terms of left ventricular ejection fraction. It has been the cornerstone for evaluating LV systolic function for several decades, despite problems related to the image quality, making some assumptions regarding LV shape, and also regarding echocardiographer expertise. But it is actually, one has to remember that LV ejection fraction less than 50% confers 10 to 12-fold risk of developing heart failure and 3.5-fold risk of all-cause mortality. So ejection fraction by echocardiography is very, very important. And not only that, when we are looking at the efficacy of medications like beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, for example, ARBs in heart failure, ejection fraction becomes very important. Not only that, an ejection fraction of 35% or less actually is an indication for ICD as well as cardiac resynchronization therapy. So we depend a lot on ejection fraction. When it comes to cardiac transplantation, again, ejection fraction less than 25% becomes one of the indications for cardiac transplantation. Also, sudden death, when the ejection fraction is decreased, there is increased prevalence and incidence of sudden death. So therefore, actually, ejection fraction is really one of the important things by echo that we use in clinical cardiology. We all know how to use it, how to apply it, and how to interpret it. It is part of our daily life. But remember, it is imprecise. It's an arbitrary method of measuring heart disease. So those are some of the limitations of ejection fraction. Well, we have looked at ejection fraction using visual assessment. They are using Simpson's method. Also, we use 3D echo because there are less assumptions, and there is low inter and intra-observer variability, and correlates very well with magnetic resonance imaging. And now, actually, we have some artificial intelligence-based newer 3D approach, which is even more accurate. So ejection fraction measurements, which had a lot of limitations, those limitations are gradually being overcome. The other thing which has come up now in the last few years is looking at speckle tracking echocardiography and specifically using a global longitudinal strain. So strain, what is strain? Strain is simply deformation. For example, myocardial thickening or myocardial lengthening or decrease in the length of the myocardium is actually a form of deformation. So what happens here? For example, if you look at this picture here, if you look at the first one, it is something where we calculate the ejection fraction, where we see the walls of the ventricle coming together, and that's how we calculate ejection fraction. But we also need to remember that the heart, actually the base of the heart also moves towards the apex at the same time. So that is something which is not taken into account when we calculate ejection fraction. So that is where we come into the longitudinal strain. So we are looking at the length, how much actually it decreases during systole and compared to the baseline, and we can calculate the longitudinal strain. There are other forms of strain like circumferential strain, area strain, which have not been actually standardized that well. Only the global longitudinal strain has been actually well standardized among various equipment. So what is actually speckle tracking echocardiography? You are looking at small dots due to interaction of ultrasound and myocardium, and they have a specific signature. Hence, 2D echo can potentially trace them throughout the cardiac cycle. So that is actually what we call speckle and what we call as speckle tracking echocardiography. So here is actually a two-dimensional image, which is a very thin slice, as you know. And when you do two-dimensional echocardiography, there is it is very easy for this speckle to move out of that the echo plane because of the cardiac motion. So there is some limitation in looking at 2D echocardiography and 2D speckle tracking echocardiography. But on the other hand, if you go for three-dimensional echocardiography, where we are looking at a pyramidal section, larger section, the chances of this speckle moving out of that pyramidal data set is lower, and hence, potentially 3D speckle tracking is supposed to be better than 2D speckle tracking echocardiography. But of course, there are limitations in terms of quality, and therefore, most of the time we go for 2D speckle tracking echocardiography. But I think more and more of us are looking at the three-dimensional approach. So what is the normal global longitudinal strain? It's actually, if you look at single center studies, in males, it is minus 17 to 24%, and females, minus 18 to 26%. But if you look at core laboratories, the normal global longitudinal strain is a minus 15 or almost minus 16%, minus 22%. So again, the minus sign is simply to show that we are plotting it because there's a decrease in the strain. That's why we call it from systole to diastole. That's why there's a minus sign. Otherwise, the minus sign has no really meaning. A normal longitudinal strain of 25% is better than a global longitudinal strain of 17%. So where we use this global longitudinal strain? First of all, it can detect subclinical diseases and also early myocardial involvement, especially in very common conditions we have, for example, hypertensive heart disease, as well as diabetes mellitus, but also many other conditions like systemic sclerosis, Kawasaki syndrome, as well as amyloidosis. We also can use the global longitudinal strain to differentiate athlete's heart from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which can be very difficult in some situations. And here again, in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, you have decreased longitudinal strain, while the strain in the athlete's heart is actually normal. Even the other types of strain are also normal in athlete's heart. So that's another indication, there's another usefulness of global longitudinal strain. Amyloidosis, most of the time, the strain actually appears preserved at the apex as compared to the periphery. So you can see here we have a red dot right in the middle near the apex. And as you go further out, it becomes actually less red and more like almost white. So it appears like a cherry on the top. So cherry on the top sign is one other way one can actually recognize amyloidosis, which is sometimes not very easy to diagnose by echocardiography. Regarding the chemotherapy in cancer patients causing cardiotoxicity, global longitudinal strain is very important, but I think Dr. Kasrival has already gone into this at very high detail. And the most important thing here is to remember that there can be a decrease in global longitudinal strain even before there is a decrease in the ejection fraction. So therefore, cardiotoxicity in some of these cancer patients can be detected very earlier than if you rely on global, or then we rely on left ventricular ejection fraction. And we also know from here that this cardiotoxicity, early detection of cardiotoxicity is very, very important in some of these cancer patients, and some of these cardiotoxicity drugs can really be irreversible, and therefore early detection is very, very important. So as Dr. Kalsiv also mentioned, something like 9 to 19% decrease in peak global longitudinal strain prior to reduction LVF is useful prognosticator for cardiotoxicity. And here actually global longitudinal strain is superior to left ventricular ejection fraction in cancer patients on chemotherapy. What about valvular heart disease, which is very, very common also? Well, we know that there's a consensus on timing of valve intervention. Asymptomatic patient with preserved LVF is lacking. And therefore, when we actually add speckle tracking echocardiography, one can predict post-surgical LV dysfunction. Also, we might be able to identify high-risk patients who could benefit from early intervention before there's a decrease in LV ejection fraction. So what do we conclude from here? When we look at LV ejection fraction versus global longitudinal strain, well, both have their own advantages and disadvantages. We mentioned that earlier on. One of the disadvantages of global longitudinal strain is the quality of imaging. If the quality is not very good, then value is unreliable. To an extent, they're complementary to each other in that case, and therefore it's best to use both in clinical practice. This is just an example to show if it works here. A difference between two-dimensional and three-dimensional echocardiography. In two-dimensional echocardiography, you're only having slices of the heart, random slices, but when we pack them together, for example, in this particular train, you can see it becomes all slices taken together. So therefore, it becomes a three-dimensional echo. And then once you have a three-dimensional echo, you can again slice that data set and look at individual slices in a very controlled and systemic manner. As you can see, these policemen are not looking for pickpockets. They have a special use here, and what they are doing is converting all these even individual people into actually a mass in the train. And so that is their function. Anyone who came on time is in that train. I'm not sure how many people suffocated in the train, but you can see how these trains are, are running in Japan. So that's one thing. The other thing to remember is when you look at the heart, the surgeons tell us, if you look at the heart, the surgeons tell us all the time that the heart is not like some ejection fraction. The walls are coming together to some extent. There is also longitudinal movement with the base moving towards the apex. But most importantly, the heart is twisting on itself, and there is also a translation motion. So as far as we are concerned, when we look at ejection fraction and global longitudinal strain, we are only looking at two of these aspects. We are not looking that much at the twist function of the heart or the rotation of the heart. And this is something, there are a lot of papers on this, and we are also starting to use this, but that is something which will look in the future. So we are still not having a very good comprehensive assessment of cardiac function when we look at only ejection fraction and global longitudinal strain. And what actually happens is that why there is a twist function of the heart, it's just like a wet towel, and you want to take out all the water from that. You are not going for motion like this, side-to-side motion. or not looking at longitudinal motion, but we are actually twisting the towel to get all the water. So what has happened actually is that what God has done, and this is something which was published a long time ago, but we didn't pay any attention to that till now, that the heart is simply a long piece of muscle, and what God has done is to actually twist it together, twist it together. So just like a towel, when it contracts, it takes out all the water from that. It becomes very efficient pump of producing cardiac output and stroke volume. So it's just a piece of muscle, and all you do is twist itself. And we found this very confusing because when you look at the heart and you can dissect it from outside, the fibers are running obliquely in one direction, you go deeper, the fibers are running another direction. We go further down, the fibers are running transversely. So this is actually something which was very complicated, but really not. And all is a piece of muscle twisted together for better efficiency. So even though we are now looking at LV ejection fraction, as well as we are looking at global longitudinal strain, and in future looking at other types of strain, one must remember that there are other things which are still there, which are still not being used commonly. And we will be doing that more in the future, looking at comprehensively total cardiac left ventricular function. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Excellent presentation, sir. I have one of the two questions. Can I have it? Can I have, the time is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
About the twist and untwist, that is true in the case of a normal heart. But in the dilated heart, either untwist functions will definitely be then affected. So can we quantify, depending upon that, in the dilated cardiomyopathies, is that has any prognostic value? That is first question. And second one is the, please answer that, sir.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about, the dilated cardiomyopathy, I think it's the same thing. We look at ejection fraction there. Of course, we all do that. And we are also looking at global longitudinal strain. And I think now, as I told you earlier, we are beginning to look at the twist function of the heart, but that is still in its kind of infancy, hasn't really come up, as much as we want it to come, will come in the future. So when it comes to cardiomyopathy, diagnosis of cardiomyopathy, we're looking at ejection fraction, changes in ejection fraction. And as you know, as some of these patients recover, or sometimes we can treat this cardiomyopathy, then the ejection fraction will improve, the global longitudinal strain also will improve. Okay.
Yeah, why I asked that question is that, so can we concentrate on the pharmacotherapy, which can improve the twist function? The major problem for the dilated cardiomyopathies is the dilatation causes the prevention of this twist much more better than in the normal conditions. Like in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, still twist function will be persisting till the terminal stages. Whereas in dilated cardiomyopathies, it may be the first thing to be then affected. So can we have pharmacotherapy on that?
Right, I agree with you. The twist function is very, very important, but it's still kind of in infancy. It hasn't really come out very well yet. Hasn't something that we can use routinely all the time, and in terms of standardization, it hasn't been really very well standardized. So that is the problem with the twist function. But as far as the other concerns are concerned, LV ejection fraction, when we give therapy to this patient, we basically look at ejection fraction so far, and now I think in addition to that, we'll be looking at the longitudinal function also. Not only that, there are other types of strain. For example, we can look at the circumferential strain, which looks at the circumference of the heart, and as you know, it becomes smaller in systole. So we can look at that also. In addition, when you look at 3D echocardiography, one can actually look at a combination of, we call it the area strain, which is supposed to be superior in some cases than looking at global longitudinal function, or only looking at even radial function becomes even superior, because you get area strain, which is a combination of circumferential strain and longitudinal strain. So many things are coming up, but I think as far as now, when we are looking at regular practice, that's what we go for, ejection fraction and global longitudinal strain. But those are more in the realms of research.
Dr. Nanda, why GLS is not yet approved by the guidelines?
What is not approved?
Why GLS is not yet come in the guidelines?
It should be coming up. I think it should be. It's very important for it to come into the guidelines. It's high time, and I think it should be coming up very soon in the guidelines. I'm very sure of that.
Last question, sir. Is that angulation, the blood flow from through the mitral valve to the nepex, from the nepex to the aorta, there is an angulation, about nearly the 45 degrees in angulation. Is going to be then helpful in assessing the LV function?
Yeah, I think it's going to be helpful in assessing LV function, especially we are looking at the flow velocities, how actually the blood is actually circulating in the heart. And usually there is quite a bit of these vortices in the heart. And what we have found is that if you look at the vortices, you have decreased actually energy. If the blood was going actually, even though it's an angle of 45 degrees, but if it was going in a laminar fashion from the atrium into the ventricle and from the ventricle into the aorta in a very laminar fashion, then actually the energy loss is much more. But on the other hand, if there are vortices, which is normally we see vortices, then the energy loss is much less. So those vortices can also be used not only in looking at LV systolic function, but can also be used for looking at LV diastolic function, because you can look at the energy loss during diastole. So those are all which are actually, there are a lot of papers being published on that, but it hasn't really been standardized very well yet. Hasn't been standardized so that you can use in day-to-day practice. Okay?
Yeah, thank you, sir. And many people are posted in the chat appreciating your talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
We now move on.
As much as possible, simplify.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda.